declaration, which we feel is a very valuable document for the solution of the problems in the field of human settlements. Thank you very much, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Spain, and perhaps I should read off those next several speakers so they know their turn and how many there are coming. The United Arab Emirates, USA, Sweden, Austria, Finland, Australia, Netherlands, Trinidad, Tobago, Rwanda, Norway, Fiji, Tunisia, Greece, New Zealand, Zambia, Uruguay, and Venezuela. I call on the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates. I'm sorry. Right. The distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me this opportunity several times at this conference to speak in the name of my brothers, the Arab delegations, at the conclusion of this great conference. I would like to say this great conference in order, first of all, to express thanks and gratitude to all the delegations which have seriously contributed to the consultations that have taken place, whether those which were conducted in our general meetings or in the meetings of committees or during the process of negotiations. Arab states, Mr. President, have tried to exert every possible effort to make this conference a success. And in particular, I would like to express thanks to these delegations which stood on the side of justice and right, and which reaffirmed the fact that justice and peace are indivisible. In particular, I'd like to pay tribute to friends, the members of the Group of 77, who have proved once more that in spite of all the attempts at sowing the seeds of dissension, they have proved the unity of the ranks in their progress for the advancement of humanity and the realization of general prosperity for humanity, because the issue which binds them is one and the same. Mr. President, the struggle of these countries has been one aimed at independence and at building a new world void of exploitation, underdevelopment, and foreign domination. And therefore, I would like to express thanks on behalf of Arab delegations to countries of Eastern Europe which have backed us in our just causes through the amendments which were submitted to the conference and which serve the objectives of this worldwide conference. Moreover, I'd like to express thanks to other friendly countries, and I must, Mr. Chairman, record my thanks and gratitude to the Arab delegations, on behalf of Arab delegations, to the President of the conference and members of the Secretariat for all the efforts they had exerted in organizing the work of this conference and in trying to make it a success. Finally, Mr. President, I'd like to express my thanks and appreciation by the Arab delegations to the people and government of Canada and British Columbia for hosting this conference in this beautiful city, the city of Vancouver. And this conference has fully justified the celebration which has taken place here. Mr. President, the persecuted and colonized peoples are looking forward to the outcome of this conference and are pinning great hopes on this conference so that it might break their fetters and condemn their persecutors. And we are certain that peoples of the world in general and the people of Canada in particular who have participated with us in this conference would stand firmly on the side of all persecuted and colonized and homeless peoples. The Iron Curtain imposed by racism and Zionism between peoples of the world through their domination of the mass media is beginning to break up in the face of the will of peoples. And the crimes perpetrated by those in South Africa and Rhodesia, as well as by the Zionists in occupied Palestine, have been revealed. Our Arab people is a peace-loving people which is wishing to cooperate with all other peoples of the world and is extending the hand of friendship to them. So in order to reaffirm the common struggle against colonialism and racism in all its forms, including Zionism, Mr. President, the Arab delegations would like to express the fact that they are convinced with the outcome of this conference, and they hope that all of us as members of this international family would apply the recommendations reached here and when we meet in other gatherings in future. And before I conclude my speech, I'd like to point out that the opinion of the majority everywhere is the opinion which governs the behavior in the international community. And I'd like to point out to those who have opposed this situation that they have to reconsider their situation, their decisions, and they have to think it over again about all the resolutions so that they may be able to adopt a better position, because the world is no longer conducted as it was conducted in the past. There are many variables, many changes, and the wise man is he who can profit from the lessons of the others and from those who were misled by their vanity. I'm not calling on any minority to change their situation, but I'm only calling on them to reconsider it. And in other fields, we notice that there are many positions that are taken which are in keeping with human conscience. And I do not wish to enter into flowery speeches or to try to say empty words, but all I'm trying to do is simply to express my conviction with justice and to pay tribute to the attitude taken by the majority of world peoples. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate.
شكرا يقول الرئيس للسيد ممثل الإمارات العربية، وأعطي الآن الكلمة للسيد ممثل الولايات المتحدة.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. سيدي الرئيس، عندما بدأنا في الإعداد لمؤتمر الأمم المتحدة للمستوطنات البشرية منذ عامين، كنا نحاول التغلب على مشكلة من أعقد المشكلات التي تناقشها المؤتمرات الدولية.
People in professional societies, universities, public interest groups, and in government at all levels have attempted to use habitat as a lever to raise public awareness and political responsiveness with respect to the challenges and opportunities in our urban nation in a rapidly urbanizing world. I'm proud, Mr. President, to report some real success in that effort at home. My delegation is proud, Mr. President, to be associated with the achievements of Habitat in promoting these purposes. And we are particularly proud to pledge our continuing efforts, nationally and internationally, to improve the quality of human experience in the built environment based on the improved knowledge and understanding gained in this historic and highly informative conference. And I would point out, sir, tonight that almost everyone here has addressed their comments to the Declaration of Action, the Declaration of Principles, and yet when we realize it, there's been a great deal more to this conference than just the deliberations of Committee 1. And we are very pleased to report that we feel substantial and highly useful progress has been made with respect to national actions in Committees 2 and 3, and that these form a really useful blueprint for nations in coping with the problems of human development. In addition to this, Mr. President, there have been many highly rewarding aspects of this conference. First, we would like to congratulate you, sir, and your country on the unprecedented efforts you and your government and your people have taken with respect to this conference, and we would particularly congratulate the people of Vancouver, whom we have found enormously receptive and friendly. We think the administrative arrangements have been as good as any we have ever seen, and extraordinarily well handled. And we really do congratulate you and your government on arranging this conference. Secondly, we would congratulate the Secretariat for its extraordinary leadership and hard work in preparing for the conference. And we are terribly pleased with the devoted labor that thousands of rural and urban decision makers in our countries have brought us to a point where world comprehension about this problem cannot retreat. We are infinitely grateful for that progress at least. At the same time, Mr. President, we are sorely disappointed that so much time and effort has been expended in discussions of problems of a political nature, essentially extraneous to the substantive work of this conference. There is good reason to believe that public esteem for the United Nations will be seriously impaired by this record. Continuation, Mr. President, of this type of tactic does not bode well for my country's support and participation in future UN conferences concerned with substantive global problems demanding international attention. Nor, Mr. President, does it contribute to cooperation and progress at conferences such as these to have the rules of procedure deliberately subverted to the political objectives of a numerical majority. Turning briefly to the Declaration of Principles, we deeply regret the inclusion in a thoughtfully drafted assemblage of important and generally agreed principles of sentences which, in a number of places in the document, by implication attack the very substance of our national constitution, and here I refer to the third preambular paragraph and all those paragraphs throughout the document dealing directly with the substantive effect of the national economic order and SERDs. Secondly, sir, we are opposed clearly to certain portions of the document that cast doubt on the sanctity of international obligations, in particular paragraph 7 of Part 2. In addition, Mr. President, we strenuously object to that language in the Declaration of Principles which deplores racism while at the same time expounding its own particular brand of racism. And we associate in this condemnation the language of paragraph 4, Part 2, the last subparagraph, Mr. Chairman, of the preamble, paragraph 5 of Part 2, paragraph 15 of Part 2, and paragraph 16 of Part 2. As the result of this language, and we certainly know we negotiated strenuously to reach a compromise during the course of the week, we have found that we must vote against this document in its entirety, while throwing nonetheless our full vote and conviction behind the vast bulk of Habitat's contribution. The agenda we have before us here, Mr. President, is the major challenge to our generation. It is the agenda of our time. Let us leave here today, Mr. President, grateful for these great steps forward and firmly dedicated to the completion of the journey. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States and call upon the distinguished representative from Sweden.
Mr. President, the Swedish government has actively participated in the work on formulating a declaration of principles for the Habitat Conference and considers that document as being of very great importance. The text we have just voted upon contains principles, most of which we warmly support. Nevertheless, my delegation found itself obliged to abstain in the voting on the declaration as a whole. This became necessary for one reason, and one reason only. Paragraph 4 of Section 2 contains a reference, inter alia, to that resolution of the General Assembly which states that Zionism is a form of racism. Sweden voted against resolution number 3379 of the 30th session, and my government continues emphatically to reject the idea expressed in that resolution. And therefore, my delegation would have voted against paragraph 4 of chapter 2 of the Declaration of Principles had there been a separate vote on that paragraph. And that, Mr. President, is why, with a deep sense of regret, my delegation has been obliged to withhold its support when the Declaration of Principles was adopted by majority vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sweden and call on the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria had sincerely hoped, Mr. President, to be able to join with those countries who did adopt the Vancouver Declaration on Human Settlements. The substance and the worldwide importance of this conference would indeed have deserved a unanimous acceptance of its principal objectives. But we had, to our deep regret, to abstain, Mr. President, because the declaration contains political elements that are not acceptable to my delegation. Had there been votes on separate articles of the declaration, Austria would have voted against paragraph 4 in accordance with our position already taken at previous occasions. I would like to ask, Mr. President, that this explanation of vote be duly registered. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria and call on the distinguished representative of Finland.
Mr. President, my delegation voted in favor of the Declaration of Principles just adopted. We did so in order to give our full support to the fundamental principles contained in it. We consider them to be of vital importance to the development of human settlements. We deeply regret that it was not possible to reach a consensus on this text. My government's firm opposition to the resolution number 3379 of the General Assembly of the United Nations is well known. To underline that this position is unchanged, my delegation would have voted against paragraph 4 in part Roman 2 of the declaration in case a separate vote had been taken, because its formulation could be understood as a reference to the said resolution. If this unfortunate reference would have been excluded, the paragraph would have had our support. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Finland and now call on the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like others, the Australian delegation regrets very much the circumstances which compelled us to vote against the declaration. My delegation contains people who have worked with their international colleagues for a long time in preparation for this conference and for a declaration to which all countries could subscribe. I might add, Mr. Chairman, that my delegation also contains a number of senior professionals in the field of urban planning and human settlement problems who have come all the way from Australia to participate in this conference. and I think it's true to say that their satisfaction with their professional and technical work in Committees 2 and 3 has had to be tempered by the activities in Committee 1. At the conference itself, I think I can claim that the Australian delegation has continued these efforts, going to considerable lengths of time, energy, and sleepless nights in the examination of compromises to try and reach some acceptable consensus. But we were informed that a stage was reached where no further negotiation was available to us. Mr. Chairman, like others, our principal concern was with Article 4, Section 2, with its apparent effort to maintain the link between racism and Zionism, and the endorsing of the definition of racism contained in UNGA Resolution 3379. Australia's position against racism and racialism is well known. And so, Mr. Chairman, is our position in respect of the General Assembly resolution I've just quoted. There were other points on which we had hoped that negotiation would ease our problems, but these would not have caused us to vote against the declaration as a whole. At the same time, Mr. Chairman, I feel bound to say that the very amount of time obliged to be spent on a very small number of items served to diffuse and divert time which, in the opinion of my delegation, should more properly have been spent on the specialist matters before this conference. Australia supports the intent of the bulk of the declaration in its technical aspects, but I would respectfully say that had our energies been more directed to these elements of the document, we would have brought it to a greater degree of precision, clarity, credibility, and consequent worldwide acceptability. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia and call on the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Mr. President, on behalf of the 9 member countries of the European Community, namely Belgium, Denmark, the Federal Republic of Germany, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and my own country, the Netherlands, I should like to make the following statement. In line with positions taken by the countries of the European Community during the 30th session of the General Assembly and the 60th session of ECOSOC, it will be completely clear that the main difficulty of the 9 delegations with regard to the Declaration of Principles relates to Part 2, Paragraph 4. The implicit reference to Resolution 3379 Roman 30 of the General Assembly, which determined that Zionism was a form of racism, meets with our strongest opposition. Our governments categorically reject the point of view that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. The 9 delegations wish to go once again on record that as far as their governments are concerned, this position is unchanged and remains absolutely unchangeable. Mr. President, if there had been a separate vote on paragraph 4 of part 2 of the declaration, we would have cast a negative vote on that paragraph and abstained on the declaration as a whole. Since a decision has been taken to vote only on the draft declaration as a whole, we could not express our view with regard to this fundamental paragraph otherwise than by voting against the whole declaration. The delegations of the 9 countries of the European Community, Mr. President, are similarly concerned about several other political issues inserted in the declaration, notably in the last subparagraph of preamble paragraph 7 and in paragraphs 5 and 15 of part 2, either in totality or in some of their language. The position of the members of the community with regard to these paragraphs ranges from general reservation to strong objection. Our governments deplore that these political issues of a highly controversial nature have been introduced in the Habitat Conference, which I may recall is primarily meant for the improvement of the quality of life in human settlements. Because of the high expectations with which our delegations have come to this conference on human settlements, and because of the very many principles in the declaration which are fully acceptable to our delegations, we sincerely and deeply regret that we have been brought in a position which left us no alternative but to vote against the declaration. Speaking now on behalf of the Netherlands delegation only, Mr. President, I would like to state that my delegation has no difficulty with those paragraphs in the declaration which deal with the establishment of a new international economic order, nor with the very last paragraph dealing with the realization of the international development strategy for the second United Nations Development Decade. With regard to paragraphs 8 and 17 of part 2 of the declaration concerning the items of permanent sovereignty and foreign investments respectively, my delegation wishes to go on record that it might have been in a position to support these 2 paragraphs if an appropriate reference to the international obligations of states had been inserted. My delegation regrets that specific proposals to improve the content and wording of these paragraphs have not been adequately dealt with. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands and call on the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the delegation of Trinidad and Tobago voted in favor of the Vancouver Declaration of Principles as a whole. We did have certain reservations as regards paragraph 4 of part 2 of the declaration. We still have. But paragraph 4 of part 2 of the declaration being put separately to the vote, my delegation would have abstained. The implications of the second sentence of paragraph 4 are in some way in contradiction with our own position. It also, by the use of the term as adopted, conceptually, in our opinion, implies a questioning of the extent of recognition of United Nations resolutions, which we consider an unhappy introduction in the intent and substance of United Nations resolutions. Our reservations in paragraph 4, of course, is in no way intended as a reservation against a struggle against racism, racial discrimination, apartheid, and all forms of colonialism and foreign domination, as our own record at United Nations bodies has in the past reflected. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Trinidad and Tobago and call on the distinguished delegate from Rwanda.
La Roumanie demande la parole.
Romania is asking for the floor.
I don't see the distinguished delegate from Rwanda. We'll add Romania's name to the list. the distinguished delegate from Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Norwegian government strongly opposed the adoption at the 30th session of the General Assembly of the so-called Zionist Resolution 3379. To us, it is totally unacceptable to equate Zionism with racism and racial discrimination. In the draft declaration adopted, there is a reference in Part 2, Paragraph 4, to resolutions adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, which must be understood to comprise the resolution which I referred to. The inclusion of this element in the declaration is the reason for our vote today. We regret very deeply that this reference was included and made it impossible to reach a consensus which should otherwise have been within reach at this conference. Had it not been for this alien element in the declaration, my delegation would have been ready to join in a consensus decision. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative from Norway and call upon the distinguished delegate from Fiji.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation generally supports the spirit and intentions of the declaration, but it is deeply regretted that it had to abstain because it had difficulties in supporting one or two of the paragraphs, in particular paragraph 4 of part 2. As regards our position on colonialism, our position is well known since we fully subscribe to Resolution 1514, Roman 15, and actively pursue the question of decolonization in the Committee of 24, since we are a member of this body. Similarly, being a party to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we condemn this practice in the context of this convention. We also reject and condemn any form of apartheid and will continue to maintain this position in all forums. In conclusion, Mr. President, may I add that if there was a separate vote on each paragraph, my delegation would have been able to support most of it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative from Fiji and call on the distinguished representative of Tunisia. I call on the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Greek delegation is happy and proud to have been a party to the voting of a document of such high principles as those contained in the Vancouver Declaration on Human Settlements. Vancouver and Canada will always be remembered for having hosted this conference, which I am sure will prove a landmark in the history of human relations. Please accept my delegation's thanks, Mr. President, for having presided over this conference with such ability and humanity. Please convey our thanks also to the Secretariat for its excellent and untiring work under often difficult circumstances. The affirmative vote of my delegation, specifically with regard to Part 2, Paragraph 4, should, however, be interpreted solely as being in conformity with the stands taken by Greece on other matters discussed within the framework of the United Nations and other international bodies and conferences. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece and call on the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I speak with a heavy heart. My delegation came to this conference with the intention and the hope of contributing to the aims the objects and the principles outlined in the original draft Declaration of Principles in document 70/4. Furthermore, we looked forward to seeing this final plenary session of Habitat crown the valuable work that took place in the preparatory committee and in committees 2 and 3 of this conference, with an equally effective contribution that could have come from Committee 1. I greatly regret that this has not proved possible and that New Zealand has found it necessary to vote against the declaration. There is much that is valuable in the declaration, but there is one paragraph in particular which my delegation could not support and which in our view introduced a harmful and divisive element into this important document. New Zealand would have voted against paragraph 4 of part 2 because implicit in this paragraph is the claim that Zionism is a form of racism or racial discrimination. New Zealand, sir, simply cannot accept this, as it could not accept Resolution 3379 of the 30th General Assembly of the United Nations. There were other minor reservations which my delegation held on aspects of the declaration. However, the major factor resulting in New Zealand's voting against the declaration was the inclusion in paragraph 4 of section 2 of the reference to United Nations resolutions. New Zealand, sir, is firmly opposed to the evils that are mentioned in paragraph 4. However, I regret that it has been impossible to reach at this stage a consensus on the declaration of principles that have been approved by a majority of the plenary session.
I thank the distinguished delegate of New Zealand and call on the distinguished representative of Zambia.
Mr. President, Zambia voted for the declaration in the very firm belief that the declaration embodied certain principles which are very dear to us. Not that we agreed entirely with every paragraph, but at least we feel that on the whole, the principles propounded in the declaration are so noble and aim at making the world better for all of us. It's a matter of profound regret to us that we were not able, due to reasons which the people who voted no have explained, to reach unanimity because we in Zambia very strongly believe in the common destiny of humanity, and we don't think that all of us have anything to gain by confrontation. We can achieve more by compromise and by negotiation than by confrontation. We do understand the positions of those countries that may have found something objectionable in the declaration, and by the same token, we would hope that they would also respect the positions of those that saw it fit to vote in the affirmative. We know that paragraph 4 is a bone of contention to a number of countries that have voted no. Some of them we do appreciate their psychological difficulties. They have some moral deficits to settle, and all we can say is that it's profoundly regrettable that it was not possible for all of us to reach a compromise so that we could have adopted these noble principles contained in the declaration by unanimity, which would have taken us a step forward towards uniting our world, which has already seen enough wars and would do without wars. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zambia and call on the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Mr. President, My delegation voted in favor of the Declaration of Principles as a whole because we feel it contains many ideas which should be embodied, enshrined in a universal document. Nonetheless, we should like to express our opposition to paragraph 4 of part 2 as amended, and our delegation would have voted against it had there been a separate vote upon it. Thank you, sir.
Thank the distinguished delegate of Venezuela, or I'm sorry, of Uruguay, for his brief but succinct statement, and call on the distinguished representative of Venezuela. Before doing so, I might mention, so others would know, the length of the speakers list. Following Venezuela is Colombia, Chile, Cyprus, Cuba, Turkey, Romania, Peru, and Portugal.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Venezuelan delegation approved the document as a whole because we feel it is of great value with respect to the models for human settlements which we have been establishing in Vancouver and which represents one of the main objectives of the conference. Nonetheless, we must point out that with respect to paragraph 4 of part 2 dealing with the general principles, we do have reservations concerning the amendment dealing with resolutions of the General Assembly. We think that this generalization covers fields in which our position has been one of abstention. In no way must this reservation be interpreted as being contrary to the struggle for human dignity and against racism, racial discrimination, colonialism, or apartheid, because in all cases the position of our country is crystal clear and consistent with the causes which our people have defended historically. Likewise, we should like to avail ourselves of this opportunity to thank the government of Canada in general and in particular of British Columbia for the hospitality and cordiality which they have given us during our stay in Vancouver and attendance at this conference. Thank you, sir.
Thank the distinguished representative of Venezuela and call on the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Creo, señor
Mr. President, I believe that no one regrets more deeply than I that we could not give a favorable vote of Colombia to the Vancouver Declaration on Human Settlements. My delegation, generally speaking, and I could almost say practically completely in agreement with a resolution whose goodness for mankind, and in particular for developing countries, is unquestionable. Had the resolution, but because the resolution was voted upon as a whole, Colombia felt it was obliged to abstain. In this way, we wanted to be consistent, fully consistent, with the position of Colombia on resolutions adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, which unnecessarily and unfortunately today have been linked unequivocally with the Vancouver Declaration because paragraph 4 was not subject to a separate vote. The Colombian delegation wishes to repeat its deepest thanks both to the government and people of Canada for the generous welcome and hospitality which they gave Habitat, as well as to all who with devotion and intelligence contributed to its splendid organization. Likewise, Mr. President, I should like to go on record to the effect that we Colombians are proud that we are proud that we can see the great work that was done by Enrique Peñalosa. We Colombians are proud of him for that. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia not only for his words but for the contribution of the Secretary General, which we are also grateful. And I now call upon the distinguished representative of Chile.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Chilean delegation voted in favor of the Vancouver Declaration on the basis of the text submitted by the Group of 77 because, naturally, we agree with its fundamental principles. Nonetheless, we felt that paragraph 4 of Part 2 does contain general principles which are very fundamental, which we fully support. But at the same time, an addition was made to it, and it was given one particular feature which implicitly has a meaning which we do not share. For that reason, and being consistent with our basic principles, we have approved the text as a whole, including paragraph 4 I referred to above. But it should be clearly understood that this does not affect our position with respect to the relevant resolutions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile and call on the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation considers the document we voted upon and adopted as the most important document of our deliberations during the last 2 weeks. We consider it, sir, as the most important because we believe that it constitutes a firm foundation on which we can base our future actions for the betterment of human settlements and better future for all people, which has been the central concern of this conference. These principles, Mr. President, provided we have the will and desire to apply them and implement them, can show us the way to the solution of many problems which preoccupy us and remain the source of friction in the world, threatening the welfare and peace of our international community. It is because of the above, Mr. President, that my delegation noted with regret the unwillingness of some countries to support this document in its entirety. I must also, however, observe, and this is a source of serious anxiety to us, that some countries who voted for all the principles are only paying lip service and do not and show no indication to adhering to the pattern of behavior stipulated in the principles and are in fact flagrantly violating them. This state of affairs should be a cause for concern to all of us because what we need is consistency, honesty, and a sense of justice, which we must apply at all times and cases and in all directions. My delegation wishes particularly to make specific mention to principles of paragraph 9, page 2, regarding involuntary migration, principle number 4, part 2, referring to human dignity and the struggle against any form of colonialism, foreign aggression, occupation, etc. Principle 5, regarding the establishment of settlements in territories occupied. Principle 6, concerning with the right of free movement and the right of every individual to choose the place of settlement within his own country. Principle 15, regarding the rehabilitation of expelled and homeless people who have been displaced by natural or man-made catastrophes, and especially by the act of foreign aggression, and also Principle 16. This set of principles, Mr. President, constitute a vital part of the whole body of the document and relate to the most fundamental aspects of the overall approach to the solution of the human problems. They are very fundamental and at the same time natural, yet millions of people all over the world are today suffering because some countries disregard them and continue to violate them. My country, Mr. President, has a very bitter experience for nearly 2 years now and is a victim of such violations of basic internationally accepted principles. We must be candid, Mr. President, and admit that we cannot constructively contribute to the solutions facing us unless we come squarely face to face with these basic problems, which the principles I made reference to cater for. It will be a contradiction in terms if we speak only partly on the problems of human habitat and ignore out of expediency the major ones. We must not continue to acquiesce to acts of aggression, occupation, dislocation of existing human settlements, and the violation of other countries' sovereignty, integrity, and generally of the human rights. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus and call on the distinguished representative from Cuba.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, fellow delegates, concluding today the Vancouver Conference on Human Settlements, speaking on behalf of the Latin American Group, we feel that we are duty-bound to thank the government and the people of Canada for the hospitality they have given to all delegates. Likewise, we should like to express our thanks because of the fine organization of this international organization to Mr. Peñalosa, Secretary General of Habitat, and Mr. Bonnie Donson, the President of this conference, as well as to the entire team of men and women who for 2 years worked intensely on this conference. We feel that this conference has been a success because during these 12 days we have analyzed the profound roots of such a complicated problem with a view to working out a national and international policy capable of contributing to the solution of this problem in all countries and in particular in the developing countries. And although a consensus may not have been reached, it was an overwhelming majority, as can be seen from the vote. We belong to that community of Latin American countries who, generally speaking, find themselves in economic, political, and social conditions which are very similar, which are determined by the situation of being developing countries which, jointly with Asia and Africa, represent 3/4 of mankind, which even today represents a world of backwardness and misery. And this highlights the very close link between the social and economic problems and the human settlements as has been recognized in this conference. But there is no denying the fact that even though these problems which do not, if we did not recognize that their dependence and backwardness depends upon this, we would not be consistent. Mr. President, the problem is first political, and only by subordinating the technical criteria, political ones, then, only then, will we have success. And we trust that all of us who have a part of responsibility of implementing the national recommendations, that we shall undertake to have these recommendations implemented, which have been agreed to at this conference. If the international community carries out the recommendations of this conference, if the underdeveloped countries are given advice with respect to the structure and planning of human settlements, while it gives technical help for the identification of resources and means and effective ways of tackling the very peculiar situations facing them, we shall then have fulfilled the noble goals set before us by this conference. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba and call on the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to make a general explanation of vote, embracing the votes Turkey have cast on documents before the conference, especially that on the Vancouver Declaration of Principles. We simply wish to be on record that our affirmative votes should be viewed within the perimeters of the statements made by the Turkish representatives from the rostrum. I would request the Secretary to be good enough to reflect this explanation of vote in their report, sir. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey and call on the distinguished representative of Romania.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Romanian delegation voted in favor of the Declaration of Principles of Vancouver on human settlements. However, we do have reservations about the amendment to paragraph 4 in the second part of the document, an amendment which read as follows. As referred to in the resolutions as adopted by the General Assembly. Thank you, sir.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania and call on the distinguished representative of Peru.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, my delegation voted in favor of the draft Declaration of Principles because we agree with its content and because we consider it an extremely valuable and excellent work for the benefit of mankind. But we want to state for the record, in connection with paragraph 4, chapter 2, General Principles, the section which indicates to resolutions as adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations the view of my country in connection with Resolution 3379 of the 30th General Assembly Session of the United Nations, which condemns Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination, was one of abstention, and we continue to maintain that position. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru and give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Portuguese delegation regrets that it was not able to approve the complete text of the Declaration of Principles on Human Settlements. Our abstention related purely to the second part and the fourth paragraph of that part. My country has every respect for human dignity and vigorously rejects all kinds of colonialism, of economic domination and apartheid. And we considered the references within the context of the document as completely out of place. We regret this very sincerely, Mr. President, in recalling the message of Stockholm and reaffirming our solidarity with all the peoples of the world. Thank you, Mr. President.
Distinguished representative of Portugal and call on the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Papua New Guinea delegation is attending its first international conference. To the delegation, it has been a rewarding and fulfilling experience. The achievements have been great. Some might try to point to the fact that there's no consensus on the Declaration of Principles and declare the conference a failure. They would be making a very wrong assessment. I say that for the benefit of the press who might be here. We have a broad brush blueprint for national action. Considerable progress has been made in developing the follow-up in terms of international cooperation. The Declaration of Principles is very idealistic and strong. It's such a document that Papua New Guinea could not conceive of not supporting it. It is well worthy of our full support, and we voted in favour of it. However, we have misgivings about paragraph 4 in part 2 and would have preferred the deletion of any specific reference to any resolutions of the UN General Assembly. We would have supported the deletion of any of those relevant words had it been possible. The PNG delegation contains solely professional people involved in human settlements and environmental issues. As professional people, they feel very strongly about the issues discussed here. They are keen to continue the work when they return home, inspired by the experience. We want to conclude by congratulating the Secretary-General, Mr. Peñalosa, and his dedicated and very hard-working Secretariat for their magnificent job, and to the Canadian government for their fantastic and magnificent job in helping to create a very significant beginning for us all. One of the unsung aspects of this great help has been their financial assistance to some developing countries to enable them to bring reasonably sized delegations here to Vancouver. This is especially appreciated, and Papua New Guinea so benefited. So after we catch up in our sleep, after we return home, we hope to get very busy and turn on with the good work and with the new ideas that we've learned from here. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea and call on the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President, for reasons beyond our control, we were not present when the Declaration of Principles was put to a vote. If the rules of procedure will permit, we would like to register our abstention in the vote rather than our absence, since we were present throughout